So first of all, a little bit of the context, the historical context. You've got Henry VIII, and two things came together for him. First was what was called the King's Matter. And the King's Matter was that he wanted an heir, particularly a son, and Catherine of Aragon didn't seem to be producing a son, and he thought if he divorced Catherine and married somebody else who might have a son for him, that would solve the King's Matter. The fact it might not have been a problem with any of his wives, but more him, seems to have eluded King Henry VIII. Anyway, he did what a monarch did in those times. He approached the Pope to get an annulment or a divorce. And unfortunately, the Pope was not in a position to grant the divorce at that time because the Papal States were surrounded by an army, and that army was in the charge of the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. So the Pope was very nervous about antagonising Catherine of Aragon, so he refused to grant the divorce. Henry VIII felt he couldn't wait any longer, so he said he was going to declare himself the supreme head of the Church in England, forget the Pope. The money that had been going to the papal treasuries would stop and they would go into the royal treasuries instead, and he would be supreme head, and he would appoint his own bishops and archbishops for the Church in England. And that's what happened. So that's the way it began. He then faced a couple of issues to do with what this church would look like. He was very conscious there was a very strong desire in the church for reform, and in particular to get rid of corruption. So it was possible in some places to buy a church office. You know, you could buy the bishopric here for a sum of money. That was called simony. There was a lot of superstition. You know, if you had a relic, it would ward off all kind of evil spirits and sicknesses from you. So there was corruption, there was superstition, and there was poor theology. You know, if you paid a priest a certain amount of money, he would do a mass for you, and that would get Aunt so-and-so out of purgatory a bit earlier than otherwise she would have. So all this kind of bad theology and a strong sense of wanting to reform in the church. So Henry chose an archbishop who had these kind of reforming ideas and was on board with the reforming ideas, and his name was Thomas Cranmer. So we asked Thomas Cranmer, who was on board with the kind of reforming ideas on the continent, and said to him, why don't you be the Archbishop of Canterbury and help me kind of manage the church, of which I am now supreme head? And Thomas Cranmer said, fine, I'll do that. And then the king had two ways of organising the church. First of all, he had to work out what was the church going to believe? What was the essence of the belief system? And so they began to put forward articles of faith. And they were meant to be kind of guides to the church to say, well, if you want to know what the church in England or the Church of England believes, start looking at some of these articles. I think it started with 10, and then there were a further 6, and the 6 were very conservative. And then a bit later there was 40, and then by the time Elizabeth gets on the throne, she brings it back to 39. I think 38 and then 39. And that's what we've got at the back of our prayer books, 39 articles. And they give you a fairly good overview of what it means to be an Anglican and the way Anglicans believe and think. So that's one way. It was all about belief and trying to embed some of these reforming ideas in these articles. But the other was, how are we going to worship together as a church? And that's where the genius of Thomas Cranmer came in, because he said, we'll put together a prayer book. I think it was about 15 years after he'd been made Archbishop of Canterbury, I think it was about 15, that the first prayer book came out in 1549. It was a little bit conservative, but it began to pick up all the kind of ideas and principles that were in Thomas Cranmer's head in the language of the people. Simplified, simplify, simplify, simplify. 7 daily offices became 2, morning and evening prayer. Instead of the calendar being packed full of saints on every day of the year, he just whittled it away to the kind of great saints of the early church, Peter, Paul, Mary Magdalene, and so on. And so you just had a minimal number of saints. They became the red letter saints in our prayer book. And because we have come to think that maybe Cranmer went a bit too far, we now have quite a number of black letter saints which fill out the the calendar a bit, but we don't want to overdo it. We understand his point of view. So simplify, and to build in the reforming theology and thinking, and in order to get rid of superstition, certainly get rid of corruption, and reform the church, get its right theology, base it on the Bible, base it on the Bible.
We'll get there still.